Today is August 14th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Whenever we talk about Christian education or classical education, there should be one subject that we focus on in those discussions. And that topic or subject we should focus on is the study of the classical languages. When we talk again about classical education is not about history studies, it's not about literature studies, not about great books or anything like that. It's not about a different teaching method, not some strange discussion of the Socratic method as a teaching method or some weird modern spin on things that we commonly hear, but classical education is first and foremost about classical languages. And if we're going to talk about any kind of real restoration of Christian education, classical education, it's going to be built upon the strongest foundation of classical language studies. Now, there are a few reasons why we need to study the classical languages. There are a few goals in the study of classical Latin and classical Greek. And these are not the kind of goals, I would say, that most classical schools or classical homeschool programs talk about. When I think of the benefits that I enjoy as one who is able to read the classical languages, even when I think back to when I was a college student and I decided to pursue the knowledge of the classical languages, I had very specific goals in mind. I wanted to be able to read the scriptures, for one. I wanted to be able to read the writings of the church fathers. I wanted to be able to read the writings of history's great philosophers. I wanted to read classical literature, but I wanted to read the writings of the real authors and not translations. For example, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are Greek poems. They're to be read in Greek. Otherwise, we're simply reading translations. I wanted to read the original sources. When we come to Catholic teaching on sacred scripture, we're taught that we should seek to study the scriptures in the original languages, and that would, of course, include Hebrew. But the classical languages, the most important benefit to be sought in studying the classical languages is that we gain direct access to all of the authoritative texts. That's the first, and I would argue the most important benefit of classical language studies. For our intellectual life, we gain the benefit of having direct access to the primary sources of philosophy, literature, Christian theology, sacred scripture, and so on. We give ourselves direct access to the authoritative texts, authoritative sources. That's benefit number one. Benefit number two, which is related to that, but I think needs to be mentioned separately, is that there are many important works that are not available in English translation. There are many important works that we can only access if we have knowledge of the classical languages. Many philosophical works, many literary works, and many works of church fathers, doctors of the church, and so on that aren't necessarily their primary works, their most famous works, but are secondary and nevertheless helpful at different times for different topics and things. And it's only possible for us to access those works if we have knowledge of the languages. And so if we're going to be serious about any philosophical or literary or theological studies, we're going to have access to the classical languages. And for me, those are my motivations for classical studies, as far as languages are concerned. And I would say for any of my students, whether they're children or adults, I would say the goal for your classical studies should be to gain for yourself direct access to the primary sources in philosophy, literature, theology, and so on. Now, when we establish that as the goal of classical studies, which I think is the proper and true goal of classical studies as far as formal school studies are concerned, when we look at a curriculum or a program of study or a school, we've got to ask, will this program, will this teacher, will this textbook, will this school lead me to that goal, lead me to fulfill that goal? The classics program that I was enrolled in as a college student at Rutgers University would certainly not have led me to that goal. It wasn't designed to lead students to that goal. Modern classics programs at modern universities are not designed or intended to lead students to that goal. And this is a real dilemma for classical studies today. The schools and the study programs, the textbooks, the college programs, they're not designed to lead students to a reading fluency in classical Latin or classical Greek. And so we've got to pursue these studies outside of these convenient courses. It would be nice if I could just enroll in a Catholic college classics department and come out fluent in Greek and Latin, but that's just not how they're designed to work anymore. They focus more on history. They focus on what they call Greek and Roman civilization, which is learning about their culture and literature and so on. And they don't give enough attention to classical language studies, reading, translating, discussing original texts and things like that for students to gain a fluency in reading. Now, other programs we'll see doing what's called living language studies, where they mess around with this Lingua Latina program, where they practice speaking Latin, and that's really just a complete waste of time. That's not going to lead to any reading fluency. It's not going to help us become or gain any mastery of real classical text. It's really just a school activity that, like I said, is largely a waste of time. There's actually no one in history, the classical masters themselves, the medieval schoolmasters themselves, never recommend that to anyone. It wasn't practiced. And we know the methods that were used by ancient masters like Cicero when he wanted to study Greek. We know in Middle Ages, in medieval education, there's a book called The Schoolmaster by Ascom, which explains the same methods Cicero talks about with respect to Latin studies. So we know how the language is to be studied, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But these modern programs, modern schools, modern college classics programs, they're not going to provide what we need. And this attempt to sort of goof around with spoken Latin, that's going to prove to largely be a waste of time. And I can give an example of where I've actually seen it proven to be a waste of time. I've told this story before, but it was really eye-opening for me. And that's why I tell it. But back around 2013, I was invited to visit a monastery and spend some time with the priests and monks at the monastery. This was a traditional, I'm just going to say a traditional Catholic religious community that prayed the divine office in Latin every day, and they were frustrated because some of the priests had been studying and studying and studying, and we're talking about decades of study. And they had been through college programs, classics programs. They'd been through these Lingua Latina type workshops and programs with living Latin, spoken Latin. And one of the priests in a private meeting that he and I had, he was frustrated and he said, I just can't understand. I've been studying Latin for 20 years and I still can't open up the writings of church fathers and just read them. Why would I not be able to read the writings of the church fathers comfortably when I've been studying Latin for so long? I still struggle in them, and the work in particular that he was referring to, that he was showing me, was a commentary by St. Hilary on the Psalms. And I said to him, the reason why you're not able to read the Latin texts comfortably is because you have not been studying real Latin. That's the problem. You haven't been studying real Latin. You've been studying this artificial school Latin that's good enough, that's not accountable to any results. There's no one examining Latin programs and making sure they're actually effective. People can really do anything they want in a Latin class or Latin program. Who's going to hold them accountable? And I can give a good example of this too. When I moved from the Northeast down to North Carolina, I was offered a job running a classics program at a big private school down here in the Charlotte area. And they offered me the job as really the classics department myself. It was just me. I was going to teach all of the courses that would provide for a classics department at the school. They were offering me the job. Not a single person, the principals, the headmaster, the vice principals, any of the foreign language department chairperson, none of the staff members who were interviewing me, none of them who went over my resume, asked me questions, talked with me about my vision or plans for the program, none of them knew Latin or Greek. And so as we came to the end of our interviews and discussions, I said to them, wouldn't you like to know whether or not I can actually teach these languages before you offer me this job? And I could tell that question made them uncomfortable because none of them knew the languages. And this is one of the problems in schools today, is that many are hired as Latin teachers, Greek teachers, and so on, who have no idea what they're doing, but they're not accountable to anyone. They're not accountable to produce any results. They're not accountable to actually lead students to reading fluency. And for most of them, I would bet that they can't read the languages themselves. And so it's a great place for a con man to make his way into education. Now, when I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I very specifically set out to develop Latin and Greek study programs that could lead students to reading fluency, so that students who had worked through our programs would be able to take up a Greek book, a Latin book, and be able to read, be able to translate, read, understand the text with the help of nothing but a dictionary. Because vocabulary is always new. Even in English, if I pick up an English book and read, I'll come across English words that I've never seen before. And I may need to look up a word in a dictionary. So there's nothing wrong with lacking vocabulary, but that's really all we should be lacking. When we pick up a Greek book or a Latin book, and I'm talking about ancient Greek and ancient Latin, When we pick up a Greek or Latin book, we should be able to understand the language. We should be able to recognize all of the grammatical details. We should recognize most of the vocabulary. The only thing we should struggle with is vocabulary. There should be, it'll be very common for us to run into a verb or a noun or an adjective or not a pronoun, but just vocabulary that we just haven't seen before, especially if we're reading new subjects or wide-ranging subjects. For example, if we read Pliny's Natural History, where he's talking about all of these natural objects and subjects from the natural world, obviously we're going to run into all kinds of vocabulary challenges. But that's okay. What we can have is ignorance of the language, ignorance of the grammar, ignorance of the syntax, and largely ignorance of a working vocabulary that anyone who's going to be fluent in the language should possess. So we have to build a vocabulary, a basic vocabulary. We have to master the grammar of the languages, and that consists of a number of different studies: etymology, syntax, and prosody. And when we do that, as we go through the grammar studies, as we develop our vocabulary, as we gain experience in reading the most important texts, and there are some texts that are more important than others, we should develop a foundation of vocabulary and grammatical knowledge, familiarity with usage, and things like that makes us fluent in reading Greek and Latin. And that's the challenge, that's the standard that any classical Greek or Latin course should be held accountable to. And when I say course, I don't mean individual class, I mean a program. So if the students work through the program, they should come out able to read Greek and or Latin fluently, comfortably, with really no need for anything but a dictionary. That's the goal. And so when I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I said, well, that's the sort of program that I'm going to put together here. None of this modern school nonsense, none of this pretending, playing around with Greek and Latin. We're going to really learn to read these languages. So when you ask the question, as many do, many write to me and ask, how can I learn Latin? How can I learn Greek? And so on. The answer is work through our program, because it's designed for that purpose. It's designed to lead you to fluency in reading the classical languages. Now, I'd like to explain in simple terms how the program works so that you can work through it if you're interested. If you get into our program and go in our study center so you can see the curriculum and see the course catalog, you'll notice that there are pairs of courses in Greek and Latin. There's a reading course and there's a grammar course. And there are a number of different levels of these reading and grammar courses. The first thing that needs to be done is the student needs to immerse himself in Latin or Greek reading. So the first reading course in each of the languages just allows the student to immerse in the language. We take a text that we're familiar with in English, because when it comes to reading, when it comes to translating, we're not like jungle missionaries being dropped off of helicopters into the Amazon forests to try and translate languages that have never been known before. That's not what we're doing. We're primarily concerned, especially at the beginning of our studies, we're concerned with being able to understand texts that we're already familiar with in English. So, for example, both of our reading courses, the Latin reading and the Greek reading, begin with the study of the Gospel of St. John. It's a very simple reading. It's a very simple text to study, easy to read and follow in Greek, easy to read and follow in Latin. The Greek, of course, is the inspired Greek of St. John, the Apostle, and the Latin text is the translation of St. Jerome, the Vulgate text. So we start with those two texts, and we take 5 verses at a time, and we simply learn all of the vocabulary in the Gospel of John, in Latin and in Greek. Now, the reason why I said before that there are some important texts that really should be the first texts we study, it's because they're the most influential texts that all of the other men who worked in these languages also studied. So, for example, if we gain for ourselves the Latin vocabulary of the Vulgate Bible, we're going to have the Christian vocabulary that was had by most Christians through the Middle Ages, because they all studied the scriptures, they all had that vocabulary. So studying the scriptures allows us to have much of the vocabulary of medieval Catholic writers. Obviously, Aristotle was studied by the scholastic philosophers. Obviously, Plato was studied. Obviously, the Septuagint was studied in Greek. So we can think about the authors that we're going to be interested in reading and think about what texts they spent most of their time reading, or what texts did they learn from, the writings of Cicero in Latin, Virgil, Caesar, and so on. And by focusing on those texts and studying and reading those texts, we'll gain a vocabulary that isn't just the vocabulary of those books, but is the vocabulary of all of the writers who studied those books. And so we'll gain a vocabulary that's very useful by studying those original sources, those foundational texts. And that's why I say there are some texts that are more important than others, and they should be the foundation of our Latin and Greek studies. So in our reading courses, we start with the Gospel of St. John. And in those courses, I assume that students can't read at all, that they have no vocabulary, no knowledge of the language, and so we simply start. We start with the first 5 verses, and I tell the students what every single word means, and they simply learn the Latin vocabulary. The same exact thing is done in the Greek reading course. We simply walk through the verses, one word at a time, and they build a Christian vocabulary in Latin and in Greek by simply learning the vocabulary of the Gospel of St. John, all the verbs, all the nouns, all the adjectives, the pronouns, and so on. And we do that through, I think it's the first 4 chapters of the Gospel of St. John, and that constitutes our Reading 1 course. So the first reading course, we simply read through the first 4 or 5 chapters, I think it's 4, of the Gospel of St. John. Now, what's interesting is as we move through that course, in the first lessons, the students don't know any of the vocabulary. As we go, St. John begins to repeat words that he's already used previously, and the vocabulary becomes more and more familiar. By the time we're at chapter 4, chapter 5, students really don't need much help anymore. The vocabulary doesn't just keep multiplying and multiplying. We just, add a word or two here and there, new vocabulary, new place name, new person shows up in the narrative, and so on. Learning the vocabulary gets easier over time, and we get to a certain point where it starts to get really easy. The lessons in the Gospel of John start to get easy, and when they start to get easy, that's when it's time to move on. And so we move on to a second level of reading, and in Latin, we move on to the Psalms. Now think of how useful the knowledge of the Latin Psalms is. The Psalms are the core of the divine office. And so as we move from the Gospel of St. John to the Psalms of David in Latin, in the Vulgate, we begin to develop a vocabulary and the knowledge of the language that we're going to be seeing constantly in our prayers, in hymns, in songs, and so on in the Catholic life. And so the study of the Psalms becomes our second study, but it's handled differently because we're at level 2 now. There's no more baby stuff. There's no more explanation of the meaning of every word. Now the students are challenged to begin translating for themselves. They've got a pretty decent base of vocabulary. And while they've been going through the Gospel of St. John, they should have also been working through our grammar course. Now, the reading course builds vocabulary at the first level, but what's necessary is for students at the same time to be working through the grammar course, because they've got to learn the parts of speech in Latin and Greek. They've got to learn all of the forms. They've got to learn the grammar, because the grammar applies to all vocabulary. Again, the vocabulary may be new, but the grammar is not going to be new. It's going to be the same. So as they work through the first reading course, they should be also working on the first grammar course, learning what's called etymology, the study of the parts of speech in Latin and Greek and their forms. When they get to the second level of reading, they have to start putting that vocabulary that they've gained and the knowledge of grammar that they've gained to work. They've got to begin translating for themselves. Now, fortunately, as I said before, they've got some help, because we're not jungle translators here. We've already got a very excellent English translation of the Latin text, and that's the Douay-Rheims version. The Douay-Rheims version, the Catholic Bible, is a literal translation of the Latin Vulgate. So it's very, very close to the Latin text, very helpful for Latin studies. And so students can take the text of the Latin Vulgate, looking at the Psalms, and they can open up the Douay-Rheims Bible and look at the English translation, an approved Catholic translation, and they can use the Douay-Rheims Bible to help them to translate the Latin Vulgate. Now, the Douay-Rheims translation is not exact, so every word is not going to match up. There's going to be some looseness in translation, some interpretation, and so on. But the students aren't allowed to use any of that looseness. They're not allowed to use the interpretation. Students are challenged to provide a very strict, what's called grammatical translation. That means that every word has to be translated. Every word in the Latin text has to be translated into English. You can't translate a phrase. You can't give sort of an equivalent translation or anything like that. It's got to be a word-by-word translation of the Latin into English. So the Douay-Rheims is helpful, addresses most of the terms in the text, but leaves some room for some grammatical work to be done. And so the students are challenged in the second reading course to translate the Psalms with the help of the Douay-Rheims. But as I said, it's helpful, but not entirely helpful. And the assessments in the second reading course require students to translate every single Latin word and prove their understanding of the vocabulary and the grammar. So that's the second level of reading. And that's for the Latin language. Now, there's another second level course. It's also called Latin Reading 2, but it focuses on the writing of Cicero and introduces students to the writings of an author with whom they're likely not familiar. So the Gospel of John is easy. The Psalms are relatively easy because we're familiar with the Psalms. That helps us with translation. But when we come to the writings of Cicero, students haven't read Cicero before, so they don't know his vocabulary. They don't know what his writings are about, and they're really left in the dark when it comes to translation, and that's intentional. Because in this course, in our Cicero reading course, we read what are called the familiar epistles of Cicero. And what familiar means is he's writing to his family and friends. He's writing to family members. And so he's not using the most eloquent language that he has access to. He's writing in sort of common everyday language to his family members and close friends. So the familiar epistles of Cicero are Cicero's simple language, his everyday language. And that gives us a good introduction to develop a knowledge of the vocabulary and style of Cicero. But we don't know the context. We don't know what these epistles are about. So the students are really challenged to lean on their existing vocabulary and on their grammatical knowledge to study and translate and understand Cicero's Latin text. And as they do that, they begin to develop a knowledge and ability to read the writings of Cicero. So that's the third course in reading. And then for students who go on, we get into poetry. So we get into the writings of Virgil, which, again, as they move through the grammar text, they move from etymology in Latin Grammar 1 into syntax, which is the rules for sentence making in Latin Grammar 2, and then prosody, which is the rules for accent, pronunciation, meter, poetry, and so on in Latin Grammar 3. So by the time they're getting into the study of Latin poetry and reading, they should already be moving into those prosody lessons in Latin Grammar 3. They also have the opportunity to study the Latin of St. Thomas Aquinas, reading and learning to translate and understand the Latin text of the Summa Theologica. So you can see the purpose of these courses is to immerse students in the text, in the most important texts, to build their vocabulary, to exercise their grammatical knowledge, and provide them with a vocabulary that will allow them to then read the writings of all of the men who read the scriptures and the Psalms and St. Thomas Aquinas and Cicero and Virgil and so on. So it develops vocabulary strategically. It develops grammatical knowledge strategically. That opens up the writings of all other authors, because all of these other authors, whether they're church fathers, doctors of the church, saints, etc., in their schooling, they studied these same sources. And so these sources were the sources of their own vocabulary and style and so on. And so that's our focus. And we do the same thing in Greek that we do in Latin. We do the same thing. We go from the writings of the Gospel of St. John, then we go into the New Testament writings of St. Paul, which get a little more technical because Paul was more educated. We then get into the writings of Aristotle and Plato, and finally the poetry of Homer. So in both the Latin and the Greek course, we immerse, and that the key is this immersion in the real language. No fake exercises, no fake textbooks, no fake lingua latina, make up your own language, none of that. We basically toss students into the sea of real Latin and real Greek and teach them how to figure it out, teach them how to learn the language and become fluent. Now, the only way to do that is to jump into the sea, as I said. You've got to go into the texts. You've got to make use of the resources that are available to you. You've got to learn how to use the grammar. You've got to learn how to use a dictionary. And just work and work and work. And when you begin, it's very slow and painstaking. And then as you continue and persevere in your studies, it gets easier. You start to move faster. And as you move faster and more easily, that's the test that you're gaining fluency. You can feel yourself gaining fluency. What used to take you 30 minutes, now you can quickly read over, and you don't even need to stop and translate it. You can just read it. And so we can be accountable. Our language study program is accountable to that experience. It's accountable to that sense of fluency that a student gains as he learns to read the languages. So if you'd like to study Greek and Latin, what you need to do is simply enroll. I recommend you start with Latin for a number of reasons, but start with Latin and enroll. If you're going to pick one course, enroll in Latin Reading 1. You're going to immerse yourself in reading the Gospel of St. John, working 5 verses at a time to learn the vocabulary, become comfortable with the Latin text, and just move 5 verses at a time all the way through the first 4 chapters. And as you do that, once you start to make progress in the reading course, which is really pretty simple, you should begin the Latin Grammar 1 course, and you should begin learning all the parts of speech in Latin. You should begin learning the forms of the declensions and the verb conjugations in Latin, and you should be looking at your Latin reading and beginning to recognize all of the concepts that you're learning in Latin grammar. So, as I said, in the first reading course, I tell the students what every word means. I tell them the translation, and they simply study it. But they don't know why the translation is what it is. They know that the translation is such and such, but they don't know why, especially as they begin to see that there are options available. Why did you choose this translation in this verse, but then that same word in the same form is also found in this verse and it's translated differently? Why is there a difference there? Students don't understand the reasoning for the differences until they begin to study grammar. And then as they begin to study the grammar, to learn the rules of the language and all of the different forms and options and different significances of the different forms, then they begin to look at their readings and say, oh, now I understand why in this place this preposition means in, and in this place the same preposition means for or to. I understand why, because they're followed by nouns in different cases. And so as the students' grammatical knowledge begins to develop, they begin to understand the work that they're doing in Latin reading, and their reading begins to change. They begin to change from students who are simply learning by faith, trusting in the teacher, to students who actually understand what the teacher's saying and why. And so by gaining that experience in Latin Reading 1, as they study Latin Grammar 1, they prepare for the work that they're going to have to do in Latin Reading 2. So to get started, if you're going to choose one course, the first course would be Latin Reading 1. And after you begin making progress, get started in Latin Grammar 1. Another course that's available is Latin Vocabulary, which is a separate course that just leads students through I think it's 150 lessons where each lesson has a topic and students learn the Latin vocabulary that relates to that topic. And as I said, there are 150 topics, so you can imagine how much vocabulary that is. Very helpful course, but that's really to be considered an elective, an enrichment course, to be added to the two core courses if a student desires. And that same course that's available in Latin vocabulary is also available for Greek vocabulary. So that's how those studies should go along. Now, once you get going in Latin, you can start Greek at any time, but the reason why I want students to start in Latin is because Latin is easier to learn, because first of all, it's the same alphabet. It's easy to just start reading Latin. But once students learn how to learn Latin, Greek can be learned in the same way. So Greek can be learned very quickly by a student who has already learned Latin in this way. And that's why I like to have students begin with Latin and then take up Greek after they've begun to make some progress. But I can guarantee you that if you follow the instructions and do the work of these courses, you must gain fluency in Latin and Greek reading. It's not a question of if, it's just whether you do the studies or not. You will know that you are gaining fluency. You'll feel yourself gaining fluency. You'll know that you can read much more easily than you could when you started. And after a while, especially when you get the grammar under your belt, you're going to be able to start picking up other Latin books, other Greek texts, and read them. And again, the only thing that you should need help with is a dictionary. The only thing you should need help with is vocabulary. That's really the test of fluency. So I can guarantee you that if you study the classical languages in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and work through these programs and follow the instructions, don't cut corners, you will read fluently. And that's not a sort of a crazy problem. You're going to see yourself read fluency, because every bit of Latin that you're going to read from day one is real Latin. It's no fake school stuff, no artificial stuff, no play, no make up your own sentences. It's just learning to read and understand real Latin and Greek texts, and not just any text, but significant, influential texts. You know, when I was in college studying classics, they had us read from Latin and Greek anthologies, and the stuff we read was nonsense. We would read, I can still remember, we read a Greek reading text that was artificial Greek, that was just made up for the lessons. And then we read from anthologies. I can remember we would read like random passages from Virgil, random passages from Ovid, random passages from less known poets, and we never really felt like we were gaining fluency. We always felt like we were just lost and were guessing, and there was none of the order and the simplicity and the productive quality that we enjoy in the classical liberal arts courses. And you'll feel that. You'll feel that within a few lessons. You'll begin to feel that things are getting more and more familiar, more comfortable. You're beginning to move through more quickly. And once you learn the method for study, it never changes. We continue to use that same method, follow that same old Ciceronian method of language study through the rest of our language studies. So once you get the hang of it, then you just get into a routine and you just start chopping and make your way through the assigned readings. So it's very effective. I think it's very easy, especially if you have experience with other programs and you've learned how useless and pointless they really are. They just don't work. They don't lead you to any sense of fluency in the languages, no matter how long you work at them. Our programs make the study of the languages quite simple, and you feel your progress. You feel yourself gaining fluency one lesson at a time. So the only thing you need to do to enroll is it's the basic student plan. Costs $25 a month, and that gives you access to any courses that you want in the academy. But once you create that subscription, you can add these courses, get started. All the courses include either quizzes to test your knowledge or written assignments. Every lesson has written assignments that I grade myself. So you'll do the work, do the translation work, answer questions about the texts, answer questions about the grammar, and those assignments will come to me, and I'll grade them and give you feedback. That's all included in that simple price of enrollment, and that's true for all courses. So if you'd like to study Greek and or Latin, starting with Latin, you're welcome to do so in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I don't think there's any program like ours anywhere. And as I said, earlier, I think I mentioned this, but if you look at other programs, other classical Christian schools or homeschool programs, if you look, there's really no staff members who have any quality experience in classical studies. They may have a degree in modern classics. They may have knowledge of a certain textbook or experience with a certain textbook, but it really takes commitment to these studies. And I've been working in these studies for 25 years, since I was 19 years old. I don't even know if that's 25 years. Let's see, when I was 20, I'm 49 now, so that's 29 years. I've been doing this for 29 years. I've been through all of the different textbooks. I know all the different methods. I've read histories of Latin teaching. I've read teaching manuals on Latin teaching written in the 1700s. I've read Cicero's teaching on how to teach Latin. I've read Quintilian's teaching on how to teach Latin. And I can assure students that our program is not available anywhere else. And I invite you to get started. I assure you, you'll be able to make progress. It's not difficult. You can work at your own pace. Once you enroll, there's no deadlines, no time limits. You work at your own pace. You're allowed to submit assignments and quizzes as many times as you need to earn perfect scores, so you don't have to worry about getting things wrong or getting a low score. You can just get back to work, fix things, study more, resubmit, up your grades, and you keep the highest grades on every assignment, every quiz. So there's just no stress, no anxiety, nothing to worry about. Work at your own pace, and you'll become fluent in reading the classical languages. So to get started, if you want to, just go to classicalliberalarts.com, read about the student plan. That's all that you need. It includes everything you need. You don't need to buy books. There's no other fees, nothing else hidden or that you need to worry about. It's just a simple monthly enrollment fee. Sign up for the student plan, then just follow the enrollment instructions, then go create a study center account, request those Latin and Greek courses as you work your way through, and that's it. Get to work, and you'll be reading. The first day of your classes, you'll be reading the Gospel of St. John in Latin. And if you think it's difficult, I've had 6-year-olds reading Latin, so it's not difficult. You just have to get to work and then give yourself time to make progress, and I think you'll begin to be motivated by that progress, and you'll be reading fluently. So that's how you can learn classical Latin and Greek in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Very easy, very simple. It just takes time. So as I said, classicalliberalarts.com is the main website. Look for the student plan, get signed up there, go to the study center, create your account, and then request enrollment in Latin reading and Latin grammar, and you're off. You'll be studying probably within 24 hours and reading Latin. So if you have any questions about studying the classical languages, or any questions about how this might also apply to other languages, like if you want to learn Spanish or French, German, Italian, you can use the same method. Once you learn the method of language study, it's very easy to add any other languages. So if you have any questions about language studies, anything you're concerned about, get in touch. My personal email address is WCM. Those are my initials, WCM @classicalliberalarts.com. Send any questions you have, and I'll help you out. But I'd love to see lots of students working in the classical languages, whether you're 6 years old or 60 years old. It's worth your time, and I think you'll enjoy it. I hope that's helpful. God bless.